You're listening to the Ask a Theologian podcast, where we explore the intersection between theology and real life. I'm your host, Dave Olson, and on today's episode, I had the privilege of having a conversation with Dr. Lau Branson. Dr. Branson's a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, but also part of a church called Fuente, where they are multicultural, multiethnic, and multigenerational, and we had a great conversation about some of the challenges and some of the insights from his book on that very topic. Why don't you grab your coffee, sit back, and enjoy the conversation today. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. I've got Dr. Mark Branson with us on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Dr. Branson is a practical theologian, practical theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. And particularly, we're going to discuss some of the things in one of his books that he co-wrote with Juan Martinez called Churches, Cultures, and Leadership. Dr. Branson, welcome to the podcast. You got recommended to me by Sudan Maros, and both of you attend the same church, La Fuente, and that's in Costa Mesa.
No, it's here in Pasadena.
Pasadena, okay. And that is a multicultural, multi-ethnic, intentional multi-ethnic
That's correct.
church.
Yes,
Is that correct?
started by a Latino team, but right off the
Okay.
bat, intentionally being multilingual, being biracial, internationals.
Awesome. Now we want to kind of push in a little bit on that whole idea. I think as the world's becoming more globalized, and the natural tendency is to cluster in homogenous groups. But what's the vision? And I know it's La Fuente, but what's the vision? You know, your book talks about a multicultural, multi-ethnic, but what does that look like in an integrated church?
You perceive it from several different directions. So on one hand, it's language. We use Spanish and English interchangeably, consistently. If you're limited to one of those, you'll still function fine because everything's translated. And that's at any meeting, any prayer, sermons, the music. So and you've got the language, the auditory. But then more than that, it's our expressed or perceived or only people. And even the way that art is in the room, or the kind of values we have as a congregation whenever we meet or pray. So because cultures are multivariate, the church needs to be that.
Sure. And although I've encountered this before, I think one of the kind of case studies in the book is you talk about a Spanish church, which I think probably as many of our Anglo-American would think, oh, Spanish church, that's homogenous. But in reality, even a Spanish church integrates so many different cultures.
Yeah, there's no way the Orange would want to be missed for the Chileans. So these were all very different cultures, even though they largely share a language, although words in Spanish mean different things in different Latino cultures. And of course, the largest Latino culture is Brazil, which...
Yes, exactly. Yes. I have done a lot of ministry in Cuba. Of course, I'm Canadian, so I've done a lot of ministry in Cuba. And yes, I am Spanish speaking as well, but I've gotten into several kind of dicey situations in Cuba, even though I was speaking the same language, but that word was not to be said in that place. Those kinds of things do happen. And so integrated to language and cultures. Tell me a little bit more about how you integrate the cultures of the different cultural expressions in La Fuente.
Obviously, these are the complexities that are in the book. We try to tease apart. The intercultural life is a very complex way of engaging in a human community. And so what I tried to do was tease out elements of that. Now, that's a very Enlightenment thing to do, right? To take it apart. Or we take apart culture and we go, okay, time is expressed different, relationships are different, modes of thinking and feeling are different. And so we take apart these pieces and talk about how that happens in different cultures. But just doing an enlightenment, dicing the subject actually could end up in trouble if you're not aware that these things are not. That's an enlightenment thing to do. That is the whole.
Sure.
And that's what La Fuente is working at. We're 10 years in. What does it mean to be a people that honor and respect and to that incredible complexity? So just using Google Translate for the announcements just doesn't do it. It's far more complex than that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we're white people think that culture is about language and food and maybe music.
Mm.
Those all really do
Right.
matter, but they don't get
Sure.
close to understanding cultural interface.
And that's the goal. I mean, this is our church. Part of our vision statement is we want to be as diverse as heaven, but that's biting off a pretty big bite when you begin to
Mhm.
get into that. I suspect that the journey for La Fuente has been fraught with many challenges.
Yeah, and I wasn't there for the first few years, but even now in the meetings, it's everything as simple as, well, one, just knowing that everything takes twice as long because you're working at
Right.
translation all the time.
Sure.
But even
Yeah.
more than that, it's what else do you have to be paying attention to? It's not
Right.
unusual in European, Euro-American culture to care about efficiency. One way that
Sure.
that's expressed is a meeting has a very clear agenda, very clear set outcomes, and a very clear timetable. Not very
Yes.
many cultures do that. And so in Latino culture, you really need the relational aspects of it. You need to make sure, how's everybody
Yes.
checking in, what's going on, and that relational element can in fact fill the whole hour before you start on the agenda. But that doesn't always help either.
Right.
So one of the ongoing conversations we
Right.
have is, what's the purpose of meetings? Is every meeting for relationships? We're humans when we arrive.
Mm.
We want to
Right.
know, we
Sure.
want everybody to know we care. But on the other hand,
Yeah.
if that's the only thing we're doing, then we may not get to some pretty important details, some pretty
Right.
important agenda items that do need attention.
Right.
And
Yeah.
can you help every person who leads a meeting in the church be aware of that tension? You have to, because
Wow.
otherwise it's always
Yeah.
floating there. It's always an issue, whether or not you
Right.
talk about it. So that's just one
Right.
small thing that comes up day in and day out.
Sure. I mean, I was in one of our locations on Sunday and just looking out over a relatively small crowd in the morning, I counted, Hispanics from a couple of different nations, Brazilians, Filipinos, Quebecois, as well as Australians, who knows what else, and English from
They're very
the
different
UK,
from Americans. Yes.
which yeah, exactly. And I've been discovering that. I had never thought about the fact that the English were so much different until just a kind of a comical story. We're quite open about this, but one of the guys in our church, new to the church, moved from England. He was starting a job in construction, needed some tools. I lent him some tools, and I said, whenever you feel like it, drop them off at my house. I'm not there. Doors open, go in. And he's had them for 2 months. He used them 2 days, and I'm kind of thinking, why haven't you dropped those off? You've been around. You could. And he said to me, I need to explain. In England, where I'm from, it's rude to go into somebody's house if they're not home, and even if they say the door's open, it's rude. And so he's wrestling with not being rude,
Yeah.
and I'm misinterpreting it. And I suspect that's the challenge. Now, one of the things you do in your book, which I think is just brilliant, is it must be coming from your practical theology side, but you suggest a practical theological process to kind of walk through these things. Can you just kind of walk us through
Yeah,
that here today?
very briefly. It's basically the purpose of practical theology is to help us discern what God is up to and how we might join. That's right at the core of
Right.
what practical theology is. Now, there are people writing about
Yeah.
practical theology that have very different, maybe it's primarily philosophical ways to construct and deconstruct or things like that. But when I talk about
Sure.
practical theology, it's about discerning what God is up to and then joining it. And that means so
Right. I like
discernment
it.
and participation become the two key issues. And so
Okay.
one of the key issues we have to raise is, why are you even asking the question when a church comes to us and
Mm.
says, we want to be multicultural? Well, is there because you're not balancing your budget with white people? Is it
Oh,
because you feel
okay.
guilty because you don't have, are you doing this because God has gotten your attention and there's something going on in your neighborhood, in your community? Is it to give you
Right.
bragging rights that, as a mega church, you've got these percentages? So, we find most of the
Sure.
time it is far more positivistic and marketing and consumer oriented than it is theological matter.
Sure. Welcome
Yeah,
to
there.
North America.
And Juan and I really wanted to make sure that this is a theological issue for us. And that's why you
Mm.
find biblical material in every chapter. We're frequently using
Right.
theological terms. You have to look them up.
Right.
And because
Yeah.
that's what students do. That's what we're disciple. That's what disciples do for
Yes.
understanding and
Yes.
wisdom, wherever they can get it.
Yes.
And the word disciple, even in making disciples, the idea of making a disciple isn't that you're making a person who has stashed all the right truths or even has all
Right.
the right piety practices. A
Mm.
disciple is a learner, which means as soon as you quit learning. You're no longer distinct. And
Right.
specifically learning
Yes.
about what God's doing in your environment, or God in my environment in
Mm.
Pasadena is drawing diverse peoples. Or if the church is
Right.
paying attention, the church will notice, okay, if God's doing this, how does that impinge on us?
Yeah. I just wanted
Sure.
to kind of interject something. Just when you describe discipleship, I mean, I caught the really the subtle difference from how I would normally hear discipleship described is because you talked about what God's doing in my environment, not in
Absolutely
me,
right.
which would be an
Right.
individualist kind of approach, which would be
Right.
more
And
typical for
we
a North
want you
American
doing that.
approach. Yeah.
Pushing your hard, you better pay attention. God wants to get at you through your
Yeah. Yeah.
eyes. God wants to get at you through
Right.
what languages you're hearing. So there's different ways that God
Right. Right.
is saying, in your neighborhood, pay attention to this. So that even runs into the
Yeah.
issue of
Yeah.
why does a church want to have an intercultural life? Yet is it primarily tactic,
Right.
or is it primarily discernment? Is it geography, which
Right.
is God seldom thinks that geography is accidental. And so if geography is not
Right.
accidental, then that's one of the ways that the Spirit gets our attention. So
Mm.
if you're interested in intercultural life, is because you read a really good book by Juan Martinez. I'm all for that.
Yeah.
It may help tune your senses differently, and that's what I'm doing. And that's where the
Sure.
practical theology comes in.
Sure.
The practical theology
Right.
cycle is simply a tool, a diagram to help you pay attention. And so let's say
Right.
the paying attention. So step one in the PT cycle is what's the current situation? And maybe what God is
Mm.
making you aware of is we're in a
Sure.
context that has X diverse cultures. And I have
Right.
these kind of neighbors across the block or over at the park. And
Right.
if that's the
Sure.
situation, and I look at our church and I don't see that diversity, that doesn't automatically
Right.
say, go hire a pastor with X language. It doesn't automatically say, you're supposed to pack in some diverse people. It may, in fact, say, shut the thing down, go join
Right.
others,
Wow.
find out where these people
Mm.
go to church and ask, can I be church with
Right.
you? I think God is
Right. Right.
probably prompting that far more often than anybody's.
Wow, that's
So
interesting.
once you're aware, here's the situation, here's who we are, here's what my neighborhood is, or we're aware,
Right.
let's say that a bunch of, our teenagers of one culture, our church, but they've all got diverse friends in high school. And what they realize is they
Right.
can't invite their
Right.
friends to church. And so one of the
Ah,
biggest
okay.
drop-offs
Yes.
is teenagers who find out their church isn't for their friends. And so
Mm.
there's all kind
Okay.
of things that you can become aware of, in which case you say to your
Right.
kids, why don't you see if they're in church and go with it? First normal
Right.
white power move is let's make sure those other kids come to our church, which
Right.
again, I'm not at all convinced
Yeah.
is God's
Yeah.
primary agenda.
Right.
So the
Right.
first step is simply being aware, but that doesn't tell you what to do. That's just
Right. Sure. But if you're not aware of what's going on, you'll
right.
never
So the
find out what
Spirit
to
will
do.
draw your attention if you ask the Spirit, help me pay attention to what you want me to see. And then the
Yeah.
next three
Yeah.
steps are different ways of reflecting on that situation and drawing in other resources. So, for instance, step two is
Right.
about the resources of your culture. Step three is about theology
Yeah.
and scripture and church history. Step four are local stories. So, all those three elements all bring you other information that the Spirit messes with as you reflect on your own
Right.
situation. So, you may need demographics,
Right.
you may need to understand the
Sure.
economics of your situation or the generational matters.
Right.
All of those are social
Yeah.
science or cultural studies matters. And you need to pay attention to those
Right.
and find different ways to surface that information. Biblical,
Okay.
theological, church history wise, Christian practices. What are the theological issues that got us to this point? What theology made our church monoculture, right?
Right. Yeah.
Or even
Yeah.
what theology moved some strangers, to use the biblical language, into our neighborhood?
Right.
Are there some
Yeah.
parents from around the world that are loving their children and diving across borders because they love their children? If we're not,
Right.
if we're
Sure.
not curious about that, then we're not doing theology. We're usually doing politics.
Right.
Theologically, one of the most famous passages with Jesus is the Nazareth sermon. We get into this some in one of the chapters. The most
Yeah.
explosive situation in his hometown was when he raised the race question. And
Talk about
so
that a little bit.
they read the Isaiah passage, which is a brilliant passage on how
Yeah.
the time of the Spirit is upon us to heal blindness, to free prisoners, to deal with economic inequity.
Sure.
This passage that itself is crazy enough, right? All of those issues
Yes.
would start fights in most of our churches.
Right.
But the people in Nazareth, being good Jewish people, hear Isaiah And they hear that connected to a messianic promise that God's going to do good by Israel. And
Right. Sure.
so they're raving about him. This is amazing. Sure, we're down.
Yeah.
That Jesus
Yeah.
refers
Yeah.
to two of their stories, Old Testament stories, when God paid attention to a Gentile, a woman
Mm.
who was going to starve,
Yes.
and a general
Yeah.
from another armed person.
Nation. Sure. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he just says, here's where God's grace shows up. And that infuriated them so much that they tried to kill him.
Mm. Okay.
So they're all
Yeah.
for good news as long as they keep it to themselves. And it's not
Right.
just a
Right.
matter of writing editorials. They are furious for the murder.
Right. Yeah. They're going to kill him.
Well, that's right
Yeah.
at the beginning of Luke, right? So Luke is saying right up front, race matters, culture matters.
Right.
And if you're not ready to pay
Right.
attention to God's grace in the context of other cultures, that you really aren't ready for Jesus.
And of course, Luke, I mean, he
Yep.
continues that theme. I mean, the greatest revelations come to anybody
Right.
but Israelites, come to the Samaritans, comes to the Romans.
Yeah,
but,
it's a core theme that from there on Luke works with.
Yeah. Yeah. That's crazy. That's crazy. Wow. And I mean, obviously the same kind of sentiments exist in our world today. You know, we live in Canada as well as the United States. It's still primarily a white nation, although that's changing a lot. And the power dynamics exist here as well. So as a church trying to, there's a lot of, I guess I would say, unrecognized default behaviors and default thinking. I think you call it life world.
Yeah, so connect those then. So there's all types of ways to
Yes.
pursue theology, better understanding of anthropology, that the human beings, your neighbors, are subjects, not objects. Your church marketing treats them as objects. So what's it mean instead to relate to neighbors as subjects? On down the list. So there's theological issues at each of these terms. The Holy Spirit's involved in your neighborhood
Right.
with your neighbors, whether you see it or not. So do you really believe the Holy Spirit's into your neighbors before you show up? Oh, how do you find that out? So these are all step
Right.
3 of the PT cycle. Or pay attention to social science,
Okay.
cultural studies, on the ground realities of humans and human society. Pay attention to theology, church history, and of both those, what forces in that world got us to where we are? So what theology
Right.
got us to separated churches? What theology got us to creating things for ourselves?
Sure.
Theology
Right.
created our segregation. But then also what theology would move us in a different, more holy, more sanctified, more spiritual direction.
Right.
And then step 4 of the cycle has to do with the local stories, both group stories and individual stories. How do you find those out? You start with your own members,
Right.
find out their cultural heritage, their cultural stories.
Right.
So to hear my wife, who's Chinese American, hear her talk about the stories of her parents is critical if you're going to be in church with her, or our biracial
Right.
older son, or our adopted Chinese son. So we've got all kinds of
Right.
variations. As we hear those stories, we gain capacity for understanding what the Spirit's doing. And without stories, everybody's just an object. They're not a subject. So churches
Right.
that don't tell stories and listen to stories can't do any of this. You miss the Spirit
Right.
all the
Right.
time. And so
Yeah.
in the midst of those 3 steps, here's our situation. Here are cultural, social realities, or theological, biblical realities. Here are local stories of groups and individuals. All of that, then you bring together to ask, what's the Spirit doing? And what kind of experiment could we run that will
Right. I love that
that would
experiment.
help us test participating with
Yeah.
what we want to do,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
don't get
Yeah.
strategic planning language out of the church. I'd forget vision statements. I would just say, go asking through, can individual churches, Bible studies, small groups, worship Sunday mornings, weekday stuff, what experiment would help us walk into what we're seeing in this cycle? So that's the
Yeah. Wow. And then, as they say, wash, rinse, and repeat. And you just keep going back through the cycle as things change and adjust, and
Exactly right.
so on and so forth. I think it's fantastic. I'm just going to just a shout out to the book. I know probably many of the listeners have not read it yet, and while it has an academic side, it's intended to be a textbook, a workbook, a guidebook with lots of practical applications and practical actions to take, which I really appreciated. And sometimes getting through the more difficult academic language was just, oh, good, there's an exercise. Let's do that.
Yeah, every
It was
chapter
really
has
helpful.
an
So,
exercises. Every chapter has significant attention to a Bible passage, the
Yeah.
tension, and then
Yeah.
Juan's chapter. Sometimes we identify the author of a chapter, and sometimes both of us
Sure.
were totally involved in the whole thing. Even where one of us wrote it, the
Right.
other edited and played with it. But chapter 10 is
Sure.
especially
Sure.
around the more activities that congregations can participate.
Yeah, yeah, and again, I just to point out that I think you've done a really incredible thing, and you've taken this book, and you haven't designed the book different than your philosophy of the whole ministry. The book is designed to be done in
Yes,
a
exactly right.
collectivist environment. It's not designed for the senior pastor to take this book, go through it, and figure out all the answers, and then tell the church
Exactly
what
right.
they should do. Yeah, which is fantastic. Now, you identify a lot of kind of, I guess I'd say, minefields, cultural areas that could cause some problems if they're not properly walked through. Can just give us a few examples of some of the maybe areas that, and I know every situation is different, but just some of the areas where, as leaders, we should be, particularly aware
Yeah,
of
this
what could
mainly
happen.
means you need to be humble and ask the people,
Right,
what does this mean? I mean, like
right,
you just need to
right.
learn and give somebody an opportunity to talk. I mean, that's a good
Yeah,
illustration.
yeah,
How we understand time and larger philosophical questions of
sure.
cyclical or linear, those kind of things, but even the timing of a meeting. When we start, when do we end?
Right,
And it was always we were in a church that was a mix of Asian Americans, mainly Asian American and Euro Americans. And worship service always started on time, ended on time. There is no
right.
flex. On the other hand, a leadership meeting would start on time and it could end whenever they all think the work is done. Or we'll let work
Okay.
expand to push our best, but we're
Mm,
not going to let worship expand.
right.
And that fit both the white and the Asian, right?
Okay.
Where the
Okay.
Latino culture would have been totally lost. So
Sure.
it isn't that there's a right way to do time. It's let's talk about it
Right.
and try different things in different encounters.
Right. So time obviously becomes
Yes.
one of those flashpoints in any situation. What a
The way
flashpoint?
that feelings work is huge because cultures have different
Okay.
understandings of feelings. Feelings that we often
Okay.
classify as negative, how, hurt, anger, depression, these kind of emotions, or emotions that are we see as more positive, happiness, peace,
Right.
joy, excitement, those kind of things. And those come to us
Yeah.
both with cultural background, where some don't feel you ought to
Mm,
express much anger, while
right.
anger's all the way through the Bible. So we might as well understand what God
Right.
intends anger
Right.
for, because it's really there. And so
Yeah.
acknowledging it and figuring out what it teaches us is something all of our cultures need.
Right.
Some cultures think you ought to be happy, if not tranquil all the time. It's a little
Right.
crazy too.
Right.
So, and those
Yeah.
come to us both out of the cultural practices of ethnicity, but they also come out of migration histories. And so all the
Okay.
issues of migration and trauma play into emotions
Right.
and
Sure.
needs attention, needs storytelling. Remember, point two was social resources, needs psychological savvy, all the different emotions, needs.
Sure.
I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
trying to think what are some others that may be easiest to illustrate.
I think something you talk about at least a little bit is the whole contrast between individualistic and collectivist
Yeah, and that one
cultures.
is really confusing because often some of the
Mm,
cultures that are so the stereotype is the
yeah.
individualistic Westerner, where everything is about me
Right.
and my happiness. Notice the single pronoun, and I'm the agent, and I'm the one
Yeah.
who has power and choice. And the collectivist meaning
Yes.
more that the group of people, society, ethnicity, family, small family or clan is
Yeah.
the entity. And that entity then
Right.
that is an actor in the world needs to be resourced and listened to. And the individual lays aside much individuality to belong to and participate in the collectivist. Now,
Right.
both those
Right.
have extremes, but they also can get
Sure.
worked. So the collectivist
Right.
can work
Yeah,
the
of course.
individual, the individual. The
Right.
individual can try to work a group to their power and manipulation.
Yeah.
And so both of these,
Sure.
neither one is pure, neither one has what's needed. But then if you look at it theologically,
Yeah.
God both honors individual agency and speaks to individuals and and
Yeah.
motivates individuals, but it's almost always in the context of a group. And
Sure.
so
Yeah.
while in the West, we talk about vocation almost as the same thing as career. It's the individual's meaning.
Mm,
Every individual is, get this, entitled, root of the problem, to meaningful paid
yeah.
work. Now, first of all, I don't
Yes.
find that any place. I mean, it's just mind-boggling where all that comes from.
It comes from
Well,
the Constitution, doesn't it?
and yet vocation, the word call in the New Testament is always used about the church. It's always used about the group. God
Yes.
called the group. The
Right.
only time
Right.
the New Testament uses call for an individual is when Paul is saying, if be worthy or attend to the calling that you have is a work to those who are slaves.
Yes.
And most of it would say,
Mm.
that's the one that the rebellions, right?
Yeah.
And it says, if you can get out of it, get out of it. But if not, be spiritual and deal with it.
Stay in it.
It doesn't use the
Yeah,
term
right.
if.
Right. Right.
There's definitely a sense in the New Testament that the calling on my church is a calling on me. Well,
Right.
my
Yes.
job may or may not connect with it. And the priority I give to my job, even as a theological professor, the attention, the
Right.
priority I give to my job, in my understanding, needs to be directly connected to the calling of my church.
Wow.
There's just no other
Wow.
way to read the New Testament data.
That's
It's not
countercultural. Yeah.
watching
That's a
all
tough
those
sell.
So it
Yeah.
isn't that we're going to flip all of that, but look what the career track approach does. It says you're supposed to leave your plan. You're
Oh,
supposed to leave your geography for the sake of American economics and corporate power.
yes.
That's the
Sure.
purpose of a
Yeah.
vocation.
Yeah.
And you may or
Right.
may not find that they treat you well, but that's the only framework for what that vocation is. Well,
Right.
world do we
I
want to sign up for
recently,
that definition?
yeah, I recently read a translated copy
Okay.
of the Didache. Of course, that's that's a contemporary to New Testament document. The collectivist view is just so in your face to me as a North American. And I thought, yeah, we're missing something. We're definitely missing something. So yeah, the individualistic, the collectivist, as you pointed out earlier, the individualistic, that's primarily a North American, West Euro-American. It doesn't exist in other cultures the same way. Yeah, so that makes it crazy. Now, I just want to come back to you talk about life stories and hearing people's stories, and I would kind of sum up your process partly in saying we have to talk to each other, have a conversation. Now, in the book, you use a particular social framework by Habermas for that. Can you just kind of walk us through that a little bit? Because I think could be really helpful for those of us in the middle.
This is a particular way to help us perceive. And I need to say that it very much comes out of the Enlightenment. I mean, Habermas is a modernist.
Sure.
He belittled postmodernity, but basically it wasn't because he thought we were implementing the Enlightenment correctly. He just thinks that the Enlightenment has more to deliver than we've taken advantage of. And
Okay.
I'm kind of there in the later book I've done with Al Roxborough.
Sure.
We deal more with challenges of modernity to being faithful Christians. So if you want to read more about why I would dissect that,
always want to read more.
And I wrote on leadership, God's agency, and disruptions is the name of it. We more directly engage the bad hand we've been dealt by the Enlightenment, theologically, leadership-wise.
Sure.
So I'm not going to just for
No, I'm with you
I
on
think
that.
is critical. But in his communication and life world theory, Habermas says it helps when you're looking at a group, especially a group that's having difficulty in seeing together and speaking together. Often he was dealing with industrial policy, economic policy, labor, all those things. And he's some pretty brilliant stuff, but way too dense for a lot of folks. What I started to deal with was what he talks about as life worlds. And the reason why I picked this up was we felt it was very much more helpful in kind of the modern reform discussions around worldview, which are even more modernist, are more segmented. And we just felt we're not going to be helpful with
the S&M boundaries are very clear.
So, but I'm still going to be talking about Habermas doing a fragmented understanding of here's the world. So Habermas would say there's an objective world, there's a subjective world, and there's a social world.
Right.
The objective world is the world that you and I can point to and talk about and some way or another agree on
Right.
some things about it.
Sure. Yeah. That's a television. That's a door. We both have the same understanding of what a door is
So
used
here's
for.
a coffee
Pretty
cup.
much. Yeah.
It ends up being things
Yeah.
that aren't helpful if we both agree strategic planning is the magic way God uses. We are naming an objective thing
Right.
that, in fact, may not be true.
It's, in
But
fact,
as
it's
much
more
as this,
subjective. Yes.
so if you're going to communication wise regarding an objective world, we're descriptive. We describe it and work at
Okay.
describing it until we're agreeing on the description. And the subject matter is
Sure.
propositional reality. That's a concept.
Right.
The validity measurement
Yeah.
is truth. And we have to have enough of a
Yeah.
common
Okay.
understanding of what's truth to do that. So, for instance, this doesn't
Sure.
exist in the
Yeah.
US at all these days.
Truth, you
Yeah,
mean,
no
or
truth, but between all kind of people in church. There's very little we point to and say
Yeah.
and describe it and agree on that. So Habermas
Right.
was right.
Sure.
We really
Yeah.
are in trouble with this stuff. So
Yeah.
that's the objective world. The subjective world
Yeah.
is what's going on in me. And the language that I
Okay.
use is expressive language. And
Okay. Yeah.
the validity, where the subject matter is story and affectivity,
Right.
feelings. And
Right.
the
How do I
validity
feel?
measurement
Yeah.
is honesty. So in other words, you don't have access to that in
Okay.
me without my honesty. If I'm
Right. Sure.
dishonest, you do not get access to it.
Which is where our accountability partners and all that start to break down
Right.
if we're not
Exactly right.
honest.
So this
Yeah.
expressive reality of the interior life of the individual is absolutely important. And we've got much of the Enlightenment that wants to dismiss it. The expressive life,
Yes.
feelings really don't matter. And so
Right.
this is
Yeah.
where Habermas was challenging what he saw going on in me. So
Right.
the subjective
Yeah.
world is about expressive speech. It's about narrative and feelings, and it's about being honest.
Mm.
So you've got objective world,
Right.
propositional knowledge, subjective world, narrative
Yeah.
and affect, and the social world is
Yeah.
us together. So it's about the norms and intentions you and I have together. So if we put together a podcast,
Right. Okay.
we agree
Mhm.
on certain things, what a podcast is,
Right.
what time we're going to log in,
Yes.
what the end of the podcast is for the audience. So there's norms and intentions that are social between you and me. And
Yes. Sure.
the type of speech is regulative. Show up at this time. Talk about these
Yeah.
things. Honor each
Sure.
other. Listen
Yeah.
to each other and speak to each other. The validity measurement has to do with what's just and appropriate for that particular social event. So where
Okay.
you've got objective world,
Yeah.
propositional truth, and that needs to be true.
Yeah.
Subjective world, language that's expressive, it's story and affect, it's about being honest. And the social world, which is
Right.
regulative, it's about what should be normal in this particular social group that would make it just and appropriate.
Right.
And a social group
Right.
needs all three lenses. And if you don't have all three lenses, if you just have propositional truth, hardly you're touching what's human.
Sure.
Or if you
Yeah.
have one of these
Yeah.
areas, expressive truth, but it can't be challenged by a proposition, then you've got a difficulty, right?
Right.
Or if my expression,
Mhm.
I'm doing
Yeah.
fine, I'm happy.
He's a lie.
And again, the social group
Yeah.
can't figure out what to do because you don't have honesty about emotions. So that's why three matter
Right.
if you're going to have what Habermas calls communicative competence. And a church can't pursue discernment unless you've got communicative competence.
Right. So if I'm to summarize everything in terms of walking through those things, the communication in those three realms needs to take place. It needs to be robust. It needs to be, as you say, honest in the subjective interior world. And there needs to have some point at which we get to the social world where there's agreement on that. So let's take a hypothetical, not so hypothetical situation. I've heard this story more than once and lived it more than once. We have a leadership group. The leadership group is primarily Euro-American. However, they are desiring to increase representation of ethnic communities. So there is a Latino couple there. And one of the supposedly agreed upon understandings of leadership is if a meeting starts at 7, everybody's there at 7. Of course, the Latino understanding is different. And so once or twice, or maybe 80% or 90% of the time, that time seems to be variable for them. The power dynamic, my understanding, the power dynamic would be you need to conform to our understanding of time to be part of this group. But that's not the best solution, is it?
further on in that chapter on communication, chapter 9, is where we talk about power, because you're exactly right. Because what you're
Yeah.
dealing with, remember my last type of speech has to do with regulatory. What are the regulations in this group? What are the norms?
Right.
And it has to do with
Right.
what's just and appropriate. And the white guy is saying, we start at
Right.
7:30. You're just totally ignoring communicative competence. You're ignoring the life world
Yes.
of
Yeah.
people that you claim are subjects in your organization. Now, that doesn't mean always start at
Right.
7:45. So I'm not giving you an answer.
Yeah.
How
I was
are you
afraid of
going to
that.
set
Yeah.
up the norms for that room? And you need to do that
Right.
together through story, through
Mm-hmm.
naming the facts, when the kids need to go to bed or get fed,
Yeah.
or the dog
Sure.
walk.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
in this group, what are the impinging factors? Those are descriptive. Here's what my evening would look like
Right.
apart from this meeting. And
Right.
here are some things that the church as a body, some responsibilities they
Right.
have given to us. Now, those may actually need to be
Right.
changed. Let's just be honest. We've received and owned some responsibilities. So that's descriptive.
Yeah.
Subjective world, I'm anxious because I want to get my kids to bed. Or I like control. I like a tight agenda. And I get
Right.
anxious and even angry if that doesn't happen. All of that's the expressive world
Right.
of everybody around the room.
Yeah.
And then you get to what are the norms and intentions? Is our intention to go through details of the agenda that we just repeat every time and they really don't matter?
Right.
So what have
Right.
been the
Sure.
norms to now? And what do we want the norms to be going forward? And again, there's no magic.
Right.
All you can do is come up with an experiment and then see if the
Right.
experiment is better for the human spiritual environment you're creating.
And then once you've tried that experiment, you're going to come back and you're going to talk it all
Right.
through
And,
again.
and often you need to run the
And-
experiment
and-
for 3 months, 6 months. Usually you learn what you
Mhm.
need to
Sure.
in something like that amount of time.
Right.
We would also say it's not a norm in this group for everybody to be overjoyed. We are, after all, at an evening church meeting, and being overjoyed is not,
Right.
but instead our expectation is we both experience respect.
Yeah.
We attend to the needs of the families, and we trust each other to say what needs to be said as we move toward decisions.
Right.
So I'm just off the top of my
Right.
head. You can come up.
Right. Yeah. 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 And that, and even as you bring those things up, I think, well, and trust has to be, which it's not automatically there just because I'm the pastor or I'm the leader of the group. It still has to be built, and honesty needs to be understood, and all of those things.
And,
Wow,
the
this
timing,
is,
who talks? So most likely a whole bunch of folks are frustrated with the new outsider who's become an insider
Right.
who's disrupted the system. But
Right.
whose fault is they're there?
yeah. Yeah.
Did you ask them here? Did you want to become bicultural
Right.
all of a sudden? So weigh the
Right.
cost and just decide to be all white, or somebody have a conversation
Right.
and somebody raise the question, let's talk about how time works in all of our families, or how time worked in your parents'
yeah.
family, because that's where we're going to
Right.
find the stories. Don't you think this is all about
Yeah.
right and
Yeah.
wrong? This is about story.
There we go. There's our enlightenment. It's all about right and wrong, and I'm generally right and you're
So
generally
let's
wrong.
apply-
And there's the
right,
power
let's
dynamic.
apply- let me say, with all due respect, most likely the pastor can't lead this, because the pastor
Right.
cannot avoid
Right. Yeah.
the power problem.
The power dynamic. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and you do point this out in your book, and I think it's an important point, is that power dynamic plays out much stronger in most non-Canadian
Mhm.
cultures. That power dynamic is a much stronger effect, has a greater effect on the relationship. And, I'll just say this, just kind of as we kind of getting close to the end of the conversation, I love how you point out, even in other languages other than English, some of the power dynamic and the relational dynamic is built into the language. I know when I was first learning Spanish, it was very hard to know when to use the formal and when to use the informal forms. French, the same thing. English, just not really a big problem. We don't even think about it. So much stuff there. Man, I just loved the conversation. I've learned so much listening, and I know our listeners will too. Any final comments or other resources
Make
you'd like
sure
to point
that
us
you're
to?
talking with neighbor pastors. Don't pretend you're genuinely
Mm.
interested in being multicultural unless you're talking with clergy of other cultures, and let them know you were
Right.
wondering about
Right.
this. Are there ways we can
Yeah.
do this together? Are there, whatever. Be
Right.
serious about what God is doing around you in your neighborhood, at civic
Yes, sounds
organizations,
good.
and
Yeah.
other churches. I've posted on my
Yeah.
YouTube channel
It's great.
quite a few interviews with clergy who are in different aspects of this and from different cultures themselves. And so
Right.
I can give
All
you
right.
that link and you can,
Sure. And we'll post it in the show notes and
and
people
just
can follow
trust
that. That'd
God
be
is
great.
always about work in diverse cultural situations. Read the Bible
Yes. Sure.
and
Yeah.
look at where God's people stumble, look where they do track with what the
Yes.
Holy Spirit's doing. And that in itself was a pretty amazing.
Right. Yes. If we had time, we'd talk about Luke
Yeah,
chapter
Morgan.
6. I love that. Or sorry, Acts chapter
But
6.
we do
But
something in every chapter of our book, we've got at least one Bible study. And
yes. Yeah. It's awesome. It's a great book. Yeah. Yeah. It's a great book. Loved it. Loved the conversation. Dr. Branson, I just again want to say thank you for taking the time and so much appreciated. And I know our listeners are going to benefit from the conversation and ultimately the kingdom of God too. So that'll be great. So thanks again for being here. Thanks for listening to the podcast today. I hope you really enjoyed the conversation. If you enjoyed the podcast and you haven't already, please subscribe. We'd love to have you as a regular listener. And also, if you wouldn't mind, just take some time and give us a quick review. 5 stars, of course. And that would be just fantastic. You can also follow us on Instagram and on X. We can be found there. If you've got a theologian or a question that you'd like us to look at or a topic you'd like us to address, why don't you drop me an email at dave@theaskatheologianpodcast.com. That's dave@theaskatheologianpodcast.com. And I'll do the best I can to make it happen for you. Thanks for listening and look forward to seeing you again next time.